Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's June 25th, 2026. Expounding on why the defeat against Iran, this memorandum of understanding as it's being referred to, a tentative agreement, a ceasefire of 2 months between America and Iran, with Israel ostensibly being cut out of the negotiations and the settlement, why that's a blessing. One of the lessons from the war in Ukraine and Russia, and then also in Iran with the United States and Israel, is that conventional warfare no longer works. It's nukes on the extreme end, or it's drones that can be utilized on the cheap and are extremely difficult for things like aircraft carriers and destroyers to track, or for tanks to defend against. Having America's inability to win wars without nukes or precision assassinations, as happened in Venezuela, and as to whether or not that was really a victory is up in the air. We talk about how the Iranian regime didn't really collapse. It just went from one figurehead or one set of leaders to another. Well, the same thing happened in Venezuela. The same regime is in power. And so both of these cases, we've had a failure of America to exact regime change. And above all else, what Trump has a remarkable ability to do is to expose everyone and everything around him. And with this Iran defeat, he is exposing the ineffectiveness of Generation 4 warfare, of tanks and ships and bombers engaged in conventional warfare. The American military spends an enormous amount on these weapon systems and bombs, but there are not conventional military targets that they're able to hit effectively. What they've been able to do in Iran is bomb the limited amount of conventional warfare, war-making capabilities that Iran has, but that hasn't stopped Iran from being able to fire missiles or to use drones to cause American forces in the Gulf area to retreat. There are multiple American bases that are no longer occupied and probably will not be reoccupied. They will effectively be abandoned because the American military doesn't have the capability to protect those bases. And so the Trump-led defeat has exposed the ineffectiveness of the American military approach in 2026, but has done so in a way that hasn't caused massive casualties, hasn't occurred against a foe that could cause an escalation in the war to something of a third world war. That has seemed like a plausible possibility over the last 4 or 5 years with Ukraine and Russia, and the escalation intentions between the United States and China with regards to Taiwan, and then, of course, now in the Middle East with Iran and Israel. Trump hasn't just exposed the limits of American military prowess, he has also exposed the utter reliance that Israel has on the United States for its ability to be the regional hegemon in the Middle East. Not many years ago, it would just be people whispering on the corners of the internet about how the Zionist project, how Israel relied almost exclusively on the backing of the United States for its continued viability, but that would be not something that would be entertained in polite company. It was outside of the Overton window, and it would lead immediately to career-destroying charges of anti-Semitism and the like. It happened to Walt and Mearsheimer. It happened to Pat Buchanan. It happened to a lot of the paleo-conservatives. But now, in the second Trump administration, the vice president himself is making explicit this thing that could not be said 5 or 10 years ago.
What I will say, and this does bother me, is that you've seen people within Bibi's cabinet who have come out and attacked the deal, and in some ways very personally attacked the President of the United States. And I guess my message to them would be twofold. Number one, Donald J. Trump is the only head of state in the entire world who is sympathetic to the nation of Israel at this moment in time. And he happens to be the head of state of the world's superpower. If I was in the cabinet of the Israeli government, I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have anywhere left in the entire world. And the second message I would give to some of those cabinet members, Bibi, to his credit, has not gone down this path, but to some of these cabinet members in Israel who are attacking the President of the United States, the other thing that I would say is that over the last 3 months, 2/3 of the defensive weapons that have protected your homeland have been built by American hands and paid for by American tax dollars. The problem for Israel is not Donald J. Trump. And anybody in Israel who thinks their biggest problem is the President of the United States needs to wake up and smell the reality of the situation that country is in.
There it is, in stark contrast to what, say, Mike Huckabee was talking about, how allegedly the United States needs Israel. The Vice President of the United States is making it clear what everyone has now, or what a large percentage of the population in the United States, let alone the rest of the world, has come to see, which is that assertion that was only made in corners of the internet and that would get you canceled if you uttered it. Almost the entire world is seeing that now laid bare, that if not for American resources, American military and intelligence support, Israel would be cooked in the Middle East. And that was what I was groping at when I was talking about last week, how a Kamala Harris presidency would be unlikely to have exposed this so clearly as it is now being exposed, because it is unlikely that the same sort of military action would have taken place in a second Harris administration. I think that things like the kinetic operations that Israel is carrying out in southern Lebanon would continue, and excursions into Syria and some of the other aggressive actions that Israel is taking would continue and would be allowed to continue. And a Harris administration would poo-poo them and offer words of encouragement to the Israelis to slow things down, but there wouldn't be the exposition of American military might going to war and then failing to achieve its objectives in such a stark way that would expose the reality that has been exposed with this second attack on Iran, the Trump administration, and that was laid out there clearly by J.D. Vance, what the consequences are for Israel. And since we're on the topic of Trump's ability to expose the id lurking underneath the public veneer that people in positions of prominence in the managerial state put forward, in 2016, he exposed the neocon Chamber of Commerce beautiful loser alliance that had controlled the Republican Party up until his civil war that he started to take it over. In his first administration, that was ineffective from a policy perspective, caused 4 years of the elite class exposing its animosity towards Russia and its money laundering operation that was Ukraine. He set that up with his first administration that became fully exposed in the Biden administration.
What do you mean by a money laundering operation in Ukraine?
Well, most famously, the Hunter Biden position with Burisma, the weapons deal that his impeachment was ostensibly about, that Trump was threatening to hold up in his conversation with Zelensky on arms deal that was sending billions of dollars to American defense contractors to arm Ukraine. Victoria Nuland making the offhand comment that there are gain-of-function research laboratories in Ukraine. Or maybe she admitted that they were biological research operations, but given that we're always operating in an environment of an asymmetry of information, it's not unreasonable to assume that she was referring to a lot of the other things that made headlines during the COVID response of 2021 and 2022, and the continued support from the American managerial class for Ukraine and its ongoing hopeless war against Russia. Trump also exposed the anti-white hate in the elite culture that pervades every nook and cranny of the managerial class. He was the quintessential New York progressive from the 1980s who famously never changed at all. It was about as Americana as it got. He was a fixture of the culture in the 80s and 90s and 2000s with the reality TV show The Apprentice that he had, his cameo appearance in Home Alone 2, his frequent appearances on Howard Stern, his association with beauty pageantry in America, all of these things. He was everywhere. He was so culturally pervasive for 30, 40 years of his public career. And then when he had the temerity to throw his hat in and try to become the Republican presidential nominee, then suddenly those 40 years of his exposure in the culture were attempted by the managerial state and by the corporate media. They attempted to suddenly paint him as some sort of unhinged extremist who was in bed with post-Soviet Russians for decades. So in their hatred for flyover America and what it represented, they were willing to shamelessly portray this person who everyone was familiar with, had been familiar with for decades. They were able to, or they attempted to portray him as the exact opposite of what everyone knew he had been for decades and decades. And so in that way, he exposed the bankruptcy and the dishonesty of the managerial class when it came to assessments of people and things and movements. He exposed the utter bankruptcy of the public health establishment during COVID. He revealed how capital S science is subservient not to truth, but to the reigning ideology of global homo. And now he has again exposed the rank opportunism of neocons who opposed him for a decade, then said they loved him when he bombed Iran the first time a year ago, and then loved him again when he demanded unconditional surrender from Iran a couple months ago. But now they've turned on him again. They've turned on him as they did in his first administration, and in so doing, expose the impotence of American military power outside of targeted special operations and, again, the specter of nuclear weapons. So speaking of Trump as the great exposer, talking about exposing, John Derbyshire famously looked at a lot of political and cultural issues in the West as an alliance between the top and the bottom of society against the middle. That is, the top of society, the managerial class, arguing in favor of refugee resettlement from all over the world, all over the third world, into the U.S., but famously not in places like Martha's Vineyard, but instead to places like Springfield, Ohio. The top of society totally insulates itself from the problems that arise from unfettered refugee resettlement, while the refugees who reliably settle into the underclass of American society reliably support politically the party and the state that keeps the refugee resettlement racket going. And the middle American middle class that opposes refugee resettlement suffers the consequences of social dysfunction, increased criminality, increases in housing prices, limitations on public services like emergency room accessibility. And despite every time they have the option expressing a preference for the refugee resettlement to stop, the middle class, the middle America tries to, through voting, through the political process, tries to affect the opposition from the top and bottom of society in this top versus bottom alliance, thwarts again and again the desires of the middle. On cultural issues, it'll be the top of society and the bottom of society coming together to do things like legalize drugs, because the top of society is able to insulate itself through private schools, and functional family structures are able to avoid the worst consequences of the drug use. The bottom supports drugs for the existential enjoyment of the drugs, while the middle class, which understands the negative consequences of illicit drugs in a way that the underclass doesn't, but lacks the structure and the resources that the upper class has to keep itself free of those drugs, is the section that ends up suffering from the legalization while opposing it. Those are just a couple of examples, but if you use this framework, there are many more that you'll be able to think of. I want to take this framework to look at the what seems like at first blush an incongruency in the way that the corporate media, that Globo Homo has looked at something like MeToo, the MeToo movement, versus Jeffrey Epstein, and more recently the rape gang inquiry report out of the UK that found 250,000 almost exclusively white British girls had been sexually abused over the last couple of decades in Great Britain. In the case of Epstein, the reason that the great and good had no interest in Epstein's curious death in 2019, and only after the Trump campaign, the 2024 Trump campaign made a big stink about Epstein, only after he was elected and then did an about face on it, only when it was perceived as politically advantageous did you start to hear corporate media talking about the Epstein cover-up. But for the 5 or 6 years previously, when it was a hot button issue in the culture that had not been resolved, there was very little interest in it, and you were probably anti-Semitic if you were fixated on it. Now that it has become, or seemingly become, clear that the Trump administration has no intention of releasing the entirety of the Epstein files, now it is perceived as politically advantageous to call for it, understanding for reasons that I wouldn't pretend to fully comprehend myself, but for whatever reason, they seem to have accurately assessed that they're not going to be released, and only now are the calls for releasing those files being made. But in 2022, 2023, 2024, there was no one among the great and good who were talking about how we needed to get to the bottom of the Epstein case. And I think that is because Epstein had a lot of friends on the top of society, and the victims were mostly from that broad middle. The perpetrators were at the top and the victims were in the middle. Correspondingly, with the rape inquiry in Great Britain, the victims were again in the middle, white working class British girls, but the perpetrators were at the bottom. They were on the other side of the alliance. It was the top and the bottom against the middle. In the case of Epstein, it was the elites preying on the middle, and in the case of the rape inquiry report in Great Britain, it was the bottom preying on the middle. In contrast, MeToo was an inner elite struggle among people on the top trying to jockey for position against other competing elites at the top. The two most prominent MeToo cases illustrate that unbroken trend perfectly. Christine Blasey Ford, the woman who nearly derailed Brett Kavanaugh's appointments to the Supreme Court, is an Ivy League professor. She's a professor at Stanford. Before that, the thing that really got the whole MeToo movement kicked off was Harvey Weinstein going down, and his accusers included Angelina Jolie, Ashley Judd, Rose McGowan, Selma Hayek, Uma Thurman, Lupita Nyong'o, that is the Helen of Troy, who is so black that she's purple, and Asia Argento, among others. So the case of Me Too, it was the victims, such as they were at the top of society. And so when there is internecine fighting among the elites, the corporate media and Global Homo will take interest in it. But when it is those elites grinding the middle into dust, as was the case with Epstein and the network surrounding him, or when it's the bottom of society, those refugees that we talked about previously, that the top of society is eager to bring in, but not have to live around themselves. Well, when those bioweapons that they bring in prey on the middle and grind them into dust, that's also perceived favorably, and so it doesn't receive any attention either. Tangentially, the cultural Marxism of Globo Homo ties into this observation about the Me Too movement and how it received so much attention. I listen to a lot of history and academic podcasts whenever women and male feminists, which are most of the men who are on those kinds of programs, they blather on and on about how the top 1% of women in the past were made subservient to the top 1% of men. They celebrate with ecstasy women who break through the mold, like Cleopatra VII or Boudica, but that, of course, is an inner elite strife from centuries or millennia ago, that from the past that is projected onto the present. That's exactly what happened with Me Too. Boudica fighting Agricola is the first century equivalent of Weinstein fighting Angelina Jolie. And the window into academia that I get from these podcasts that interview academics, this is the consistent angle that is given play, that the top 1% of women are subjugated by the top 1% of men, but far less attention is paid to the fact that 99% of men and 99% of women had it a lot worse than the top 1% of women did in antiquity. And to bring it back to the present, that is the case now. Me Too mattered because it was an inter-elite struggle session, a jockeying for position among the upper class. Epstein, and especially the rape gangs, don't matter because the victims deserved it, and exposing it isn't useful for the managerial class for Globo Homo because they aren't harmed from it and they can't benefit from it.
As we record this on the evening of June 25th, there is late-breaking news. The U.S. Supreme Court has issued two decisions on immigration-related cases. Reading from the Wall Street Journal, the Supreme Court on Thursday allowed President Trump to take away legal protections from hundreds of thousands of immigrants who until now had been permitted to stay in the U.S. for humanitarian reasons. In a 6-3 ruling, the court's conservative majority rejected arguments that the administration was driven by racial prejudice when the Secretary of Homeland Security ended the protections for Haitian immigrants. Trump has repeatedly disparaged Haiti as filthy and disease-ridden and called it a, quote, shithole country. None of the cited statements by either the president or the secretary was overtly racial, and in substance, all expressed policy views that could rest on race-neutral justifications, Justice Samuel Alito wrote in the majority opinion. Alito concluded that courts have little power to review the executive branch's decisions about the immigration program at issue known as temporary protected status. That program, which Congress created in 1990, allows qualifying immigrants to temporarily remain in the U.S. and work legally if their home countries are experiencing armed conflicts, natural disasters, or epidemics.
Something that Haiti, as a consequence of being full of Haitians, has perpetually been experiencing since 1804.
This decision makes something that should have been obvious clear, that temporary means temporary. These Haitians, in many cases, have been here for years, and they were only supposed to be here on a temporary basis. And this decision just means that basically about 350,000 people from Haiti and around 6,000 people from Syria are immediately eligible. The Trump administration can immediately terminate their temporary protective status benefits, which means that the Trump administration should immediately marshal the adequate resources and get their ducks in a row to deport these people as soon as possible, because the closer we get to the midterms, the more difficult that's going to be, especially if the Democrats end up taking the House and possibly the Senate. They might be able to gum up the works, but this is the opportunity that somebody like Stephen Miller needs to take advantage of, and I suspect that he already has plans in place. He's been waiting for this moment. The other countries that have been designated for temporary protective status are Somalia, South Sudan, Myanmar, Sudan, El Salvador, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Yemen, and Lebanon. There was also another immigration-related ruling that the U.S. Supreme Court issued today on Thursday. This one was also written by Alito, and it allows the administration to turn people away at the U.S.-Mexico border without giving them a chance to formally claim asylum. Kagan wrote in her dissent that she cited numerous derogatory statements that Trump has made about Haiti, such as his claims that Haitian immigrants eat dogs and cats and, quote, probably have AIDS, end quote. She also noted that Trump has said repeatedly that immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood, end quote, of America. Trump's comments, Kagan wrote, are, quote, so repellent and racially inflected that the majority declines to put them in print, end quote.
So implicit in that dissent seems to be that there is constitutional protections extended to non-citizens. In other words, why do comments made by the executive branch have any bearing on the constitutionality of decisions about immigration status being granted to non-citizens?
Couple of questions there. I think the first one is the difference or the distinction made between American citizens and non-citizens, and what rights apply to citizens versus non-citizens. Certain things like the Supreme Court has found that even non-citizens are granted certain due process rights, for instance, but obviously they wouldn't be granted the right to vote, I guess, unless you're in California, maybe. But so there are distinctions that citizens and non-citizens have. For the most part, non-citizens don't have rights, don't have constitutional rights, but they do get certain levels of due process. The basis for denying Trump's actions or invalidating Trump's actions, if it were found that his actions were purely motivated by racism or purely animus based on a protected characteristic, an innate characteristic like skin color or race or ethnicity or even religion in some cases. There are certain instances where a policy can be invalidated if the policy was motivated purely by animus based on certain characteristics like those. And I don't know the ins and outs. There's something called the animus doctrine, and I think it seems to derive largely from the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and that's extrapolated out to mean that the executive can't make decisions purely out of animus towards a particular group. But again, I think that would pretty cleanly apply if for instance, Trump were directing executive branch agencies to deny or to grant benefits to American citizens based on their race or based on their religion or other protected characteristics. But we're dealing with non-citizens. And so I think that that bar is a lot harder. And in this case, Alito at least found that even if Trump made what could be seen as offensive or racist comments, there were enough legitimate non-racist reasons given in official documentation and proclamations and explanations for these policies.
Another protected class in the civil rights lexicon is national origin, so I suspect then that it really is citizenship status here that is the differentiator. That is encouraging to know the highest court of the land, that if it's the right policy but it's for the wrong reasons, then it should be thrown out.
Speaking of animus directed toward a particular group, we covered Kanye West and his views on the Jews back in May of 2025. The episode was entitled Yay, Hitler and Anti-Semitism. Since the 2000s, Kanye West had been making bizarre, outrageous comments and public appearances, from his statement that during Hurricane Katrina that George Bush doesn't care about black people, to storming the stage during an award show in 2009-ish and taking the microphone from Taylor Swift. Kanye has always been somewhat controversial, but none of his antics ever in any way hurt his career or hurt his bottom line. And it was only when he started speaking about Jewish control of media, particularly in his industry, the hip-hop industry. There are a lot of Jewish producers and people behind the scenes of many of the popular hip-hop artists of the last 20, 30 plus years. And Kanye West had always been aware of that. There are statements, again, from early in the 2000s where he had made comments on that, but they had never been picked up or had gained much traction. It was only in the late 2010s up into like 2020, 21, when he started being very increasingly vocal about this, his qualms or his grievances with Jewish control of hip hop. And I think Ness observed that, in his view, Kanye had realized that while he had thought he was breaking boundaries and pushing the envelope and breaking taboos, Kanye perhaps realized that he was all operating within an acceptable frame. He was operating within the Overton window, and while he might like to think he was an avant-garde artist who wasn't going to be controlled by anyone, he decided to really test that theory when he started talking about Jewish control, and immediately he faced real consequences. His Adidas deal was canceled. He lost millions and millions of dollars. His shows were canceled. He became persona non grata. And he did release a song called Heil Hitler, and that was banned, and it was very hard to access. So that is all set up for some more recent developments. We've been meaning to cover this for a while, so we're a little bit behind, but I want to give some updates on Kanye West in 2026. I'm going to start with this paid advertisement that Kanye West took out in the Wall Street Journal on January 26, 2026. It's entitled To Those I've Hurt by Ye, formerly known as Kanye West.
The Wall Street Journal, of course, being the premier public-facing newspaper of international finance. This could have conceivably run in something like USA Today, and it would have had more or less the same effect, but it's especially pointed that it was in the Wall Street Journal of all places, and Kanye West had to pay for the privilege.
So I'm going to read a few excerpts from that, I don't know what you want to call it, paid advertisement. 25 years ago, I was in a car accident that broke my jaw and caused injury to the right frontal lobe of my brain. At the time, the focus was on the visible damage, the fracture, the swelling, and the immediate physical trauma. The deeper injury, the one inside my skull, went unnoticed. Comprehensive scans were not done, neurological exams were limited, and the possibility of a frontal lobe injury was never raised. It wasn't properly diagnosed until 2023. That medical oversight caused serious damage to my mental health and led to my bipolar type 1 diagnosis.
So building on what Jeff had said earlier, Kanye West realized when he bumped up against Jewish power that in the victim hierarchy, being a black man going against Jews is a dicey proposition. And so he's trying to add to his resume here neuroatypicality, or that he is differentially abled due to an injury that he experienced. What's being set up here is that he wasn't in control of his faculties. Effectively, he was being controlled by something bad. It wasn't the real Kanye who was saying the things that he said.
Continuing on with the letter, I lost touch with reality. Things got worse the longer I ignored the problem. I said and did things I deeply regret. Some of the people I loved the most, I treated the worst. You endured fear, confusion, humiliation, and the exhaustion of trying to love someone who was, at times, unrecognizable. Looking back, I became detached from my true self. Jumping ahead, I am not a Nazi or an anti-Semite. I love Jewish people. And here's all of that is pretty predictable, nothing really surprising to me. But the most surprising part is the following. To the black community, which held me down through all of the highs and lows and the darkest of times. The black community is unquestionably the foundation of who I am. I am so sorry to have let you down. I love us. And continuing on, in early 2025, I fell into a 4-month-long manic episode of psychotic, paranoid, and impulsive behavior that destroyed my life. As the situation became increasingly unsustainable, there were times I didn't want to be here anymore. I'm going to parrot what Ness was saying. I think the purpose of this is to discredit any of the critiques that Kanye West made about Jewish control and Jewish influence in the music industry, and essentially associate any of that kind of talk with mental illness, and further connect any sort of talk about Jewish control or Jewish influence, connecting that to mental illness and paranoia.
Yes, in much the same way that racism is a public health crisis, and that is what permitted the George Floyd rioters and protesters to take the streets 2 months after everyone had been locked inside on account of COVID. So is Kanye West effectively saying here that anti-Semitism is a sort of mental illness, and anyone in the throes of it isn't really in control of their own faculties because they are either mentally ill or just irredeemably evil. And as for the seeming bemusing talk about how much he loves the black community and how upset he is for having let them down, this slots well into the top and bottom versus the middle, because when it comes to racial and ethnic categories, Jews are at the top, blacks are at the bottom, and Gentile whites are in the broad middle. And politically, Jews vote very left, blacks vote very left, and the middle-class Gentile whites vote more to the right. And so Kanye West, by falling into what the conventional wisdom portrays as hard anti-Semitism, that is associated with the darker aspects of the middle America. And so as a good black, as a good leader of the bottom, he should not have come after the top in the way that he did. And he is now apologizing for having done so and trying in the capacity that he is able to dissuade any blacks who might have taken him seriously, taken some of his critiques of Jewish power to heart.
There is a long history of black criticism of Jews in the United States. There was heavy Jewish influence in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. One of MLK's top advisors was a man named Stanley Levison. He was a New York attorney and businessman and heavily involved in left-wing causes in the 1940s and into the early 50s. He worked with the Communist Party, and so he was a top advisor to Martin Luther King and helped him with organizational, logistical issues and helped edit some of his writings and speeches. And so there's some critique among some more, I guess, black nationalist types like the Black Panthers or the Malcolm X types who look critically at that Jewish influence and think that maybe the true black movement was subverted or diverted or watered down in some ways. And then in the American South, in the antebellum United States, Jewish Americans owned more slaves per capita than Gentile Americans. And so the point is there's enough raw material there. There's enough historical, factual information for Black Americans to, at the very least, ask some questions about Jews. And then, of course, more recently, like we were saying, the influence of Jews in the music industry.
Yeah, and just to interject briefly, SDA, which is a survey interface, has a publicly accessible survey of blacks in Chicago from 1997. And one of the questions that are asked is whether or not respondents think that Jews are bloodsuckers. That's really what the question is. And 30% answer in the affirmative that they are, in fact, bloodsuckers. In that top versus bottom alliance, the bottom blacks have a tendency to go off the reservation, as it were, and voice things that the top, as long as they're able to ignore them or just write them off, if these are like if it's just the Black Israelites or it's Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam, if it's able to be politically and culturally marginalized, that's fine. But when it's someone like Kanye West, well, there's already a lot of sentiment below the surface that he's able to tap into, and that's why he is so emphatically apologizing here to signal to his overlords that he disavows everything that he said and that those who might be influenced by him should do the same.
It's also important to put this in the context of Kanye releasing a new album called Bully, which came out on March 20th, I believe, of this year. And this is in the context of Kanye having had 11 consecutive #1 debuts. Jumping ahead to April 7th, 2026, reading from a Wall Street Journal article titled, Kanye West Banned from Visiting UK for Festival, Forcing Organizer to Cancel Event. The UK government has barred Kanye West from entering the country following a backlash over a planned performance at a London music festival and the rapper's history of anti-Semitism. Event organizer Festival Republic said it was canceling Wireless Festival, scheduled for July at North London's Finsbury Park, after the decision by the UK Home Office to block West from visiting the country. West was slated to headline all 3 days of the festival. The Campaign Against Anti-Semitism said the UK government had made the right decision in barring West. So I guess that letter that Kanye took out in January wasn't quite enough to prevent the UK from banning him.
The UK ban notwithstanding, there are many people in America who have been banned. Famously, 2 decades ago, Michael Savage was banned from the UK on account, I think, of racism, maybe even anti-Semitism, despite the fact that he is Jewish himself. That a corporate festival was initially planning to have him take part after the letter went out, after the apology groveling letter went out, that it shows that it was to some extent successful. Had he not recanted of the Heil Hitler messaging, I doubt that this festival, including sponsors the like of PepsiCo and Anheuser-Busch, would not have invited Kanye West. And so it brings to mind the witty perspicacity of this seemingly timeless subject that was observed by the late, great Norm Macdonald.
Well, earlier this week, actor Marlon Brando met with Jewish leaders to apologize for comments he made on Larry King Live. Among them, that, quote, Hollywood is run by Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted the actor's apology and announced that Brando is now free to work again.
Though the Kanye debacle does show who holds the whip with regards to cultural critiques, things that are labeled as anti-Semitic, while that still holds, the cracks in the foundation of that cultural power structure are showing more and more. Just this week, in 3 primary congressional races in New York City, in all 3 cases, the anti-Israeli candidates won against the opposition of the Democratic Party structure. In particular, Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House, opposed all three of the winners in those primaries. And these are inside of New York City. And so the primary is the actual contest. They're going to win by 80-90% in the general election. I don't want to over dramatize that. I don't think just because Hakeem Jeffries backed the losing candidates in these three races that he is not going to still become the Speaker of the House after Democrats retake the House in November. But this does dovetail nicely with the admonition that J.D. Vance seemed to be giving Israel in saying that Trump is almost uniquely among world leaders the only one who still has a positive view of Israel. And traditionally, to bring it back to Walton Mearsheimer, one of the main arguments in the article and book that they wrote 15 years ago was that there was a uniparty consensus in the U.S. supporting Israel and whatever Israel did. And what J.D. Vance seems to be saying and what seems to be happening is that it's no longer uniparty support in the U.S. for Israel, but increasingly it's becoming the Republican Party in the U.S. as the sole institution that still supports Israeli foreign policy. And again, I don't want to overstate the significance of this. I don't think it is eminent, but it does show a shifting in sentiments, and not just a shifting in sentiments, but how that change in sentiment is starting to trickle up the ladder of power. And this is not a trend that's going to end anytime soon. It's still a long way away from Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries coming out as unapologetically oppositional to Israel's aims. But that is a real consideration, and that is what J.D. Vance is communicating in words, the same thing that these electoral results are communicating in political outcomes. How that is going to be interpreted is an open question yet to be answered. Someone named Bin Sabti, who I'm not going to pretend that I had heard of previously, although the best I can suss it out, it looks like he is member to a think tank in Israel that is roughly corresponding to, say, like the Heritage Foundation or Cato here in the U.S. He wrote on X 4 days ago originally that, quote, maybe the USA needs another Pearl Harbor or 9/11 to remember who is the enemy and who is the friend, unquote. He has since edited that slightly to just talk about how Iranian regime terrorists are the real enemy and that the USA would be wise to remember that and not look at Israel as an enemy. But the original was probably more candid, and it is worth considering that an incident like the USS Liberty attack is not out of the question if Israel feels increasingly desperate, if this rift or seeming rift between Trump and the neocons and Israel, if that is a real rift, it really does signal a change in orientation of the second Trump administration with regards to American support of Israel, which is how I interpret it. I think these are tough words, talking about how it was tough for Kanye West to walk back the Heil Hitler song that he put out, to somehow walk that back. Well, it's tough for the vice president to walk back saying that basically the entire world hates Israel, which is what he said. And so if this is a real rift that has occurred, then I don't think it is out of the question for the sentiments of somebody like Bin Sabti to manifest in horribly consequential ways. And with regards to the sentiment expressed by that think tank guy in Israel, I would be remiss if I didn't mention results from an Economist YouGov survey this week asking Americans if they think that if American leaders believe an agreement with Iran would benefit American national security, should they pursue it even if the Israeli government opposes it, even if it puts Israel in a more compromised position. And 58% of respondents said yes, the U.S. government should do that. Just 10% said no, and another 33% said not sure. And so by a 6-1 margin, those who had an opinion one way or the other said that the U.S. national interests should take priority. This is pretty common sense populist rhetoric that is America first in its most distilled, but it's not just something that MAGA supporters back. In fact, in this poll, Harris supporters were more likely to agree with that sentiment that America should do what's in America's best interest with regards to a treaty with Iran, even if Israel opposes it. 69% of Harris supporters agreed with that, compared to just 7% who oppose. So in the case of Harris voters, it was a 10-1 margin rather than the general population being a 5-1 margin. Among Trump supporters, 58% supported it, only 11% opposed. And so that too is exactly in line with what J.D. Vance was talking about and what the results of the primaries in New York showed on the Democrat side, that Americans are, like the rest of the world, fed up with what Israel is doing. And it's really only by the grace of Trump himself that Israel is able to survive at all. I mean, it's somewhat hyperbolic to read Vance's comments that way, but I think that really is the subtext. And I think it illustrates, too, why there seems to be so much hysteria in response to accusations of dual loyalty of Americans or people existing in the United States, but with a primary concern for the well-being and the outcomes in Israel. I think that is why they responded historically so harshly to those accusations, because there is a lot of sentiment that is in opposition to this dual loyalty, even in the era, even a decade into the era of America First and MAGA being associated with racist, bigoted, backwards, redneck Trump supporters. Even in that case, still people of all political stripes say that America's interests should trump Israel's, and the perception that the entire world now seems to share that America's interests are being subservient to Israel's in the Middle East in really catastrophic ways. Well, if the paradigm is shifting for real, it's hard to think of things that would indicate that being the case more so than these couple of things like J.D. Vance's comments and the results of the election and the primary, these polls. There's a confluence of factors that really makes it look like Israel's time might be running out. And so it'll be interesting, to put it euphemistically, to see how Israel responds to those things changing, if they are in fact really doing so. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.